All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get started on today's panel. All right, and with us today, we have 5 panelists. Well, I'm sorry, 4 panelists and myself moderating. So today's panel, we're going to talk about traffic stops. We are fortunate today to have with us 2 law enforcement experts who are going to be speaking to our community today. We have Chief Umberger from the DeLand Police Department and Assistant Chief of Police Hans Lehman from Lakeland Police. We're also with us today is Dr. Sven Smith from Sociology and Senior Sociology student Wilson Grooms. And the question that we're going to discuss today is what makes for a good traffic stop? So something that has certainly taken up a lot of space in our minds and hearts and in the news are the interactions between our civilian population and our police population. And so this panel has some experts who have some insights on how to improve those relationships and possibly explain some of the information that we are seeing and observing in the media in our own lives oftentimes when we think about interactions with our citizenry and our law enforcement. So I do want to remind those of you who are in the room who have come in for cultural credit at the end of this panel around 2:45, we will go ahead and post a link for you to observe. To complete the cultural credit form, and you will have until the end of the day. So that will happen at 2:45. So I won't take up any more time. I will go ahead and allow each of the panelists to introduce themselves briefly, and then I will go ahead and sort of direct this question to each of them for their feedback. So we'll go ahead and begin with Chief Umberger, if you don't mind. Getting us started.
Absolutely. First of all, thank you, Sharmaine, for inviting me to participate. It's my great pleasure to do so. A little bit about me. I'm beginning my 28th year in police services. The first 24 years were spent outside of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, at a municipal police department in central Pennsylvania. And I became the police chief there at the end of my career, and retired from that agency and have been the police chief here in DeLand for the past 3 years and 4 months or so. And that is me. I mean, there's a lot more to me than that, but I think for brevity, there you go.
Thank you, Chief. And so we'll move on to Assistant Chief Hans Lehman. Thank you.
Hey, good afternoon. Thanks for having me as well. And first Go Hatters. Graduated back in '94 with the BA in sociology. So I was hoping this was an on-campus thing so I could see campus again. It's been a little while since I've been there, but thanks for having me. Been with Lakeland a little over 24 years, assistant chief in special services, which is our street crime, SWAT, traffic, all those kind of type groups, and then Polk County Sheriff's Office for 2 years before that in our community policing section there as a deputy. And then while I was at Stetson, I was a firefighter EMT with Volusia County Fire Service as a volunteer, but went through full firefighter EMT standards. So that's me in a nutshell.
Thank you, Assistant Chief. And so we'll move on. Dr. Smith.
Hey, thanks very much for having me, Dr. Jackson. I am Sven Smith. My appointment here is in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology. My area of focus or my research is law and society matters. I am also an attorney. I'm a former assistant state attorney, and I'm also a former prosecutor with the Attorney General's office. Did that for a while too. I've been practicing as an attorney for 20 years. So again, I'm very happy to be part of this esteemed panel. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. And Wilson, if you'd like to introduce yourself as well.
Yes, good afternoon. Thanks again, Dr. Jackson, for this opportunity. I'm Wilson Grooms. I'm a senior sociology student at Stetson. And I'm currently ongoing working on senior research based around the question of what makes a traffic stop go bad and end up on the news like the way we see it. So this summer I conducted a number of interviews with officers of the Lakeland Police Department and did some content analysis of the television program Live PD for that.
Thank you, Wilson. All right, so I am just going to go ahead and allow the panelists to sort of speak to their particular insights on traffic stops and civilian and police engagements in those. And in particular, what insights do you have? What insights have you gleaned in either your years and years of experience engaging in these different kinds of interactions, or in your own research? So if you could sort of shed some light. So I guess just kind of going again, round robin, I'll start with Chief Umberger. If you can talk a little bit about sort of your insights and sort of what have you worked on in your police department, what experience do you have, and how can you shed some light in helping us understand what's happening in society?
Okay, with regard to traffic stops?
Yes, that would work, yeah.
Yeah, so obviously, you know, being a career law enforcement officer, prior to becoming a chief, I was an officer. So I made thousands of traffic stops and had thousands of interactions with citizens, both on traffic stops and other calls for service. What I see, or what I think is critical to a successful traffic stop is the attitude that the officer approaches the traffic stop, as well as the attitude of the person that's stopped. I think it starts there. You know, when an officer stops, makes a traffic stop, there's an unknown for the officer and as well as the citizen. The citizen is probably nervous and apprehensive because they were stopped. Nobody enjoys getting stopped by an officer. And you know, those first several seconds of interaction, I believe, are the most critical. And how that officer interacts initially is going to likely set the tone for the rest of the traffic stop. And you know, officers are trained that, you know, to treat individuals with respect and be as transparent as they can, explain to the person why they were stopped, and you know, have an exchange, have a professional encounter. You know, what we ask for from a citizen standpoint is that they, you know, remain calm as they can and polite, and they follow the instructions of the officer. You know, obviously, you know, keeping, you know, from a perspective of an officer, when we walk up on a car, you know, probably 99% of the time it's a routine traffic stop, you know, for a violation. But again, there's a little bit of unknown until we establish some rapport and have some initial interaction. So, you know, as a motorist, you don't want to be making a lot of movements. You know, if you can keep your hands on the steering wheel, and then, you know, make slow and deliberate movements when officers will ask you for, you know, your credentials, that would be helpful. And just, you know, a good exchange, is tantamount.
Thank you, Chief, on that. Assistant Chief Lehman, what are your sort of intakes and thoughts on that? Do you also sort of piggyback and kind of echo the same kinds of sentiments? What else can you sort of offer or lend to our understanding?
Yeah, the one thing I never call a traffic stop routine, and I know the media uses that word a lot. I spent almost 10 years in our traffic unit as a traffic homicide investigator, DUI officer, so I wrote a lot of tickets just like the chief did. You know, we're getting out of the car and going up to a car with tinted windows or whatever that car is. We've never seen the inside of that car, so we have no idea what's going on in that car, as well as we're approaching. They don't know what to expect. And in my time, I've just always found it easier just to identify myself, tell them why I stopped them, and ask for information. They may disagree with running the red light, but at least they know why I stopped them. And that seems to sometimes, you know, put a little bit of it at ease there. And, you know, the entire thing is we're looking for voluntary compliance. You know, none of us go out there looking to pick a fight or profile. It's we're looking to enforce the law, and that kind of goes to a thing of, you know, they call it the 3 E's of traffic safety, which, you know, engineering, education, and enforcement. So we're always that third wing of that. And a lot of times when our officers stop cars, they've been assigned to an area because of complaints. You go to neighborhood meetings, and the biggest complaints in neighborhood meetings are drugs or drug sales and speeding. So that's what a lot of times gets us to a certain area. And, you know, it's, you know, firm but polite. The chief has already said all that, you know, treat people decent with respect. And you know, that's kind of what I look at when I'm going into these things. And when we teach people in the academy and field training officer schools and things like that, we try to reiterate it. And I've always found if you spend a couple extra minutes with a person, you always say if you spend a few extra minutes with a person, they probably wouldn't call and complain for that rudeness perception. And that may be all it is, but that's some of the things that I look at.
I think that's really, yeah, important when we think about what kinds of that word routine, right? That is, you're right, something the media uses. So I think that is, it is important to distinguish what actually happens, right? I suppose there's a certain way in which officers are trained to interact, ways in which the civilian population are told to de-escalate. I think this is something we talked about before we came into the session, is this idea of de-escalation or not escalating encounters. But of course, right, every traffic stop is going to have some element of the unknown to that. I'm actually going to go to Wilson next, and then over to you, Dr. Smith, after Wilson, if that's all right. Wilson, you look specifically at traffic stops, which is why I kind of came in on this question in this direction, because I know it ties directly into your question. So can you talk a little bit about your research and how and what insights that you sort of gleaned?
Mm-hmm. So traffic stops are very unique interactions, specifically between an officer and civilian. It's not the same as going to a grocery store and dealing with a clerk or anything like that. You have a participant who's very unwilling. Like if you get pulled over, it's obviously not your best day. So officers tend to be aware of this to some degree. And so many officers, most actually, go above and beyond to be personable, to build a rapport, to kind of get beyond the uniform. And then at some point, when a situation escalates, because through the duration of this, they're still, their training is involved. And so they're scanning, they're alert. When things escalate to the point where the training must kick in, say someone is moving or the situation becomes dangerous, then the officer reverts to training mode, and that can be jarring for the person dealing with the officer in the situation, kind of this reverting from rapport to almost order giving. And so it's a jarring difference. And then going along with that, especially with what's going on in the media, talking to officers, there's a lot more people these days who are absolutely terrified of police. And that makes it difficult as an officer. It's hard to tell the difference between someone who's scared because they're suspicious and someone who's scared because they feel like you're going to take their life from them. And so that further complicates the issue of building rapport.
Thank you, Wilson. Dr. Smith.
Yeah, the literature, so listening to these responses, what I think of, kind of trying to have my head in the books about this is the literature calls this, community policing or problem-oriented policing, where the policing is less reactionary and is trying to be more working towards problem solving, not for the community, but with the community, about the community, like together, right? And so I think the guy's name is George Kelling, is a guy in criminology that's big in this area, and I'm sure Wilson is familiar with this guy, right? And so he's big in the criminology stuff, and he talks about community-oriented policing and how there can be, in the research that's done since that time, like in the 20 years since that he started talking about that stuff, it's been up and down. And I think one of the reasons why, sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. In other words, and sorry to speak, like, I need to be more practical in what I'm saying. Like, police will get together with the community and say, okay, if your problem is, Assistant Chief Lehman is saying, if your problem is speeding or your problem is drugs, what do you as a community suggest to us as ways that we can still do our job, of course, within the bounds of doing our job? What are the things that we can do to, solve that problem for you, and like incorporate them into the discussion. And so that's some of the things that I see here in DeLand with our chief, trying to do. I don't know how successful that is, because one of the things that the literature suggests is that, and this isn't my expertise, but I had to take a comp on it. I had to take a test on it. So this is what I remember from that. And so that some of that has to do with like where you're pulling from, like what's the pool that you're pulling from initially, right? So like, who are you working with in terms of not just your community, but also the officers that you're working with? Like, how integrated of a community are you beginning with before you had these problems? And so my interest here in being on this panel is hearing from other panelists, with regard to like, how is it, the chiefs talked about attitude, and the, Professor Thaver made a comment about those initial seconds, like those first few seconds that Assistant Lehman talked about, Lehman talked about, where those beginning seconds are crucial. But like, even before that, the literature on this community policing stuff says that, like, what preconceived notions are you dealing with on both sides? And so if you're the chief of this, right, and you're trying to instill this community policing, as I can tell, I mean, I can't speak for our chief here in DeLand, but I would imagine that he's trying these kind of incentives. It might not have anything to do with what I'm saying or the research, but like I can see these incentives. And so I can see how difficult that might be given the fact that there's pockets of DeLand and pockets of Lakeland. According to my own personal experience, I'm not speaking from the literature now, but according to my own personal experience, I grew up in Central Florida. I graduated from Stetson in '96. And I can tell you there are some racist pockets. I mean, there's all sorts of pockets, right? But there's some racist pockets. And so pulling police officers and then dealing with problems related to that too, you know, so you have perpetrators as well. How is it that the chiefs are able to negotiate that and get the kind of attitude that they need from their officers to ensure that a good job, you know, that the appropriate stop becomes so appropriate that it does become routine, you know, that you can count on it being routine, you know. Anyway, so that's a question that I had, and I might have overstepped my bounds a little bit. I'm just excited about getting a chance to talk to them, and appreciate my opportunity. So thanks.
No, thank you for that, Dr. Smith. I'm going to jump in and actually maybe summarize what I heard, just for everyone to sort of think about, and also just to I guess add my own thoughts on that. And so I think, Dr. Smith, you raised some interesting points. One of this idea of community policing, right? And so that's a question that anyone could answer on the panel. What is it to do community policing? Right? How is that different than, say, traditional policing? The other question, the underlying, right, sort of elephant in the room is that while power, you know, this power between police and the population, the citizenry, definitely, right, is part of the equation, so is race, right? And so to what degree does race bear down on these interactions, right? The race of the law, you know, of law enforcement, the race of the community that's being engaged. And so I think that is definitely a timely question, right? That is part of what that question exists in our minds as a population. Then there was this other question of negotiation that Dr. Smith popped out there. How do you negotiate in this kind of field? You all are in leadership, you know, the two chiefs are in leadership positions, but you also have to negotiate the culture and the climate and attitudes, not only of your officers, but also you're dealing with the community as well. And so how do you navigate in that space? So I guess that's community policing. Where does race fit in, and how do you negotiate that? And then Dr. Smith mentioned Dr. Thaver, who commented in the chat. So he was reading the chat there, who had a comment about what happens in those initial moments and thinking about bias, which I think also plays into that question of race. And so community policing, race, and then negotiation. Any of those, feel free to jump in there. Anyone on the panel want to, or any of the chiefs, Wilson, if you want to also add in what you may have pulled out. So thank you, Chief Umberger.
Yeah, so I guess your summarization was great. I mean, let me address community policing and what I believe that is. I do not believe community policing is a program. And I believe it's a way of policing that we all police. I think the traditional thinking was, you know, we have this community policing section, and they do, you know, they teach DARE, they do National Night Out, they do all these activities associated with community policing. And I believe that community policing is much bigger than that, and it's a culture that we create within our organization of, my focus on community policing is relationship building with members of our community, and utilizing opportunities that are not enforcement oriented. In other words, when we're not on official calls for service and being called places to do police work, that we take the time to get out of our vehicles and walk a foot patrol or get on a bicycle and do a bicycle patrol and build relationships and get to know the people that we're policing in the specific areas of our responsibility, such that we begin to gain an understanding one to the other about each other's expectations. If we don't have a relationship with people based on common, interests and dialogue, how in the world, when we get into a stressful situation, are we going to be able to communicate effectively? And that all goes, I believe, as we build positive relationships, we're gaining legitimacy in the community, and we're building trust. And those things pay huge dividends when we have these moments, the moments of stress where officers have to take actions, and we expect community members to maybe come into compliance more quickly to help us resolve situations. But without relationships, that's just not going to happen. So at DeLand, as in my agency in Pennsylvania, we have several initiatives, and really the initiatives are all about getting our officers out of their cars, trying to have positive interactions with people in their neighborhoods, in schools, in parks, anywhere we encounter people that it's not enforcement. It's just come up and introduce ourselves and have a conversation. I noticed one of the folks that has joined our chat is Miss Kathleen Cormack, who is the founder and facilitator, and then I helped her co-found a thing called Conversations with Police. And that focus is to build trust between young men, and particularly young men of color, and police officers. And we have worked very hard, and she has done the lion's share of the work, trying to bring young men in the community to law enforcement, to have these meaningful interactions in a safe environment. And that's just one, that's a program, right? But its whole focus, really, I think if we got down to it, is relationship building. I'm talking a lot. I don't want to dominate the thing, but I guess the second point was, the negotiation part, and how can we negotiate that? And I think it's about trying to help people understand the job that we have, and then us listening to the community about the perceptions that they have about us and how they feel when we interact with them. And those are all important aspects of that negotiation, that back and forth, so that there's understanding. And if we have understanding, if we're talking with one another, then we have a chance to be successful. It's when we don't speak, when we're not talking and we go into our corners, is when we have conflict.
Thank you, Chief Umberger.
I would say the same thing. My computer is doing a reboot on me, so if you lose me for a second, I'm trying to get my other computer fired up. But we're 250 sworn at Lakeland, so we do have 11 or 12 dedicated, what we call neighborhood liaison officers. So they do go do a lot of the problem solving and try to focus on solving problems that take longer to solve than a shift or one call. But we do preach community policing to all of our officers. Take that extra time, get to know your neighborhoods. Our shifts are set up so that you bid a zone and you're there for a year. And you may move around the city just based on calls for service, but you're responsible for that zone on your squad for that year, and then you may move around to another zone or another part of the city and the next year. So we kind of have a hybrid approach where we do have some dedicated folks that really focus on the problems to try to solve them in the preventive nature, and then we have the other part of the customer service and embracing everybody in the community as well, neighborhood meetings, just like the chief mentioned.
Well, thank you for that, Assistant Chief Lehman. And good luck with getting your computer to reboot. Did you have something else that you wanted to add?
No, not right now. I mean, Chief's covered a lot of it. You know, it just you get back to traffic stops, and that's just the fear of the unknown is something else I want to talk about on, you know, both ends. Nobody knows what to expect from the other person, and just trying to de-escalate that in the very beginning can make a traffic stop go a lot easier.
Yes, definitely. So I think that raises another question, right? What is the unknown that's sort of going on, right? And I think for officers, it's how dangerous is this person coming towards me? But what about the unknown for the community? Both chiefs have mentioned doing community work. So I would be curious if that ever came up. So what are the unknowns that the community worries about? And then how do you sort of alleviate some of those concerns? And anyone on the panel could also speak to that.
So I wanted to answer that a little bit and kind of pivot off of a point Dr. Smith made. He brought up George Kelling, he was mentioned in an excellent book from last year, written by Malcolm Gladwell called Talking to Strangers. And the basis for that book was about the interaction with Sandra Bland in Texas that ended in her arrest and eventual suicide. And he posits that a lot of the issues we have in community policing is based upon proactive policing and pretext stops. And so he traces it back to Kansas City. So in the 1970s, Kansas City, Missouri was having an issue with inner city crime, gang violence, gun crime. So Kelling ran an experiment in the city. He divided it into 3 different neighborhoods. With one, he removed police and they only answered calls to the neighborhood. One, they left the patrols regular. And then another, they doubled police presence randomly throughout the neighborhood. And that found that there was no difference, and simply showing force of police, there was no difference in the cutback on crime. So fast forward to the 90s, the city's still having the same issue, but it's very localized and it's a lot of specific communities. And so they're looking for answers there. So you have a criminologist, Lawrence Sherman. He starts trying some different things. With one neighborhood, he has officers go door to door with a pamphlet on gun violence, kind of build a community relation in this neighborhood to try to get some more calls, to try to solve, because it's a very particular, it was like a 2-mile square radius where a lot of the gun violence in the city was happening. And with that, they went door to door, they covered every house in the neighborhood. And that whole year, or the month following, there was only 2 additional calls to 911 about gun violence. And so the issue was these people were good community members not leaving their house. And so they weren't able to report on a lot of the gun violence. And so they moved to pretext stops, taking advantage of the ability of an officer to pull over a suspicious vehicle for a traffic violation. And so they started doubling patrols in the neighborhood, but not only that, but going ahead and pulling over for missing brake lights and failure to signal and rolling stop signs. And they cut the gun violence in half almost overnight by searching people, finding guns, finding drugs, finding weapons. And so the lessons learned from this, every police department in America saw this and said, we want to replicate this. And so you see this rise, especially recently, of pretext stops. We've had 20 million stops a year. This is from last year, which comes out to 55,000 a day, which is a lot of stops. Well, the issue is this was a very localized example in a high crime neighborhood that had a gun problem. So when you take officers pulling people over for small things like brake lights out and failure to signal, when in reality they're looking for the big drug bust of the century, you have a lot of people who come off with a bad opinion of police. And I think overall that creates further issues when people feel like they're being pulled over for no reason, and it leads to further issues down the road. So I think that's where Malcolm Gladwell takes the argument and is not in favor of that. But I just thought that was an interesting point.
I'll weigh in on that, Wilson. Yeah, the pretextual stop issue, again, kind of going back to what Assistant Chief Lehman said, you know, the most common complaints that we get are about drug activity and speeding in neighborhoods. And, you know, what then do we do as police leaders? You know, we put resources into that area to try to alleviate the complaint that the citizen has made. And so in a sense, you could say that enforcement that we're doing in that neighborhood, we're called there to do, wherever that neighborhood may be. And lots of people are going to get caught up in those stops, right? Regular everyday people that really might not be involved in the activity, whatever that activity is, you know, that's being complained about it. If for say it's drug activity, you know, obviously if you're speeding, you're speeding. But, you know, our increased presence in any given area is going to produce, you know, more contacts and maybe what the citizenry would deem as negative contacts. You know, why are you here? And I think that's where it's critical, where officers need to take that time to explain to motorists and people that they're stopping why they are there. And that's a matter of trust too, right? Does the community member, the motorist, believe what the officer's telling them? Or do they think that's just, oh, you're just giving me the canned response? And that goes back to the relationships, right? And building legitimacy and trust in the community. You know, are we an agency that is viewed as trustworthy and transparent, or are we, you know, are our officers suspected all the time of kind of nefarious behavior? But to go to that, back to that, you know, we respond and put resources where people complain, and when we do that, there's invariably more contact. And it's kind of a catch-22 for law enforcement, right? If we ignore the complaints that the citizens are making and we don't put resources there, then the police chief and, you know, then the people take it a step further. They might complain to the police chief, or they may complain to the elected officials. You know, why aren't the police being responsive? So just so you kind of, you know, everybody has an understanding of both sides of that.
That's very, very helpful. Thank you for that context, Chief Umberger. I put a note in the chat that if people have questions, just put them in the chat. We will get to them as they arrive. And so I'm going to also bring up another issue that has yet to really sort of be delved into, and this was the issue of race, right? So we're talking about the community, urban, inner city, gun violence, drugs. You know, I study race. This all becomes coded language, really, to talk about Black communities and Black people. And we have to look in the media, right? Where are these interactions where we're seeing deaths in traffic stops, in police custody happening within the Black community, and oftentimes these being white officers. And so I definitely think a lot of the points raised are important points in dealing with legitimacy and trust and getting out on the ground and talking with people. But then how do you deal with the question of race? And I just leave that out there for anyone to answer this question of race.
Well, I'll
say,
jump. Go ahead,
Chief. I'll say a couple of things. Being over the hiring section at our department, one, not everybody right now wants to be a police officer. So your applicant pool, when you talk about race and you think of diversity in an agency, you know, we always try to mirror the demographics of the community we serve. That's one of our accreditation standards as well. So, but when you think of that, there's also portions of a city that where maybe they generate probably 70–80% of the calls of service. So you may see more presence in those areas. But that all goes back to there's only a certain number of police officers. So, you know, well, I need an African-American officer on this call, or I need a Hispanic officer on this call, or I want a female officer on this call. we only have so many. So when you're dispatched to it, the officer's going to it and he doesn't know who's on the other end of that call. And that's kind of where the customer service part comes into, is you treat, the golden rule, treat everybody the way you want to be treated. And I'm sure DeLand PD does the same thing. We kind of try to keep pushing that in our officers as daily reminders, treat people. We've had some FTOs say, treat people like it's your grandma. You wouldn't treat your grandma that way. And, it just kind of hits home. And in my mind, I try to look at it as, who's the customer, and I try not to look at race and gender. And it can be hard. I know we talk about bias sometimes, depending on, you just don't know what to expect. But I think you take all of that into the big picture when you're looking at, you can't just say race on this, because you got to talk about hiring and who we hire, and then who are we serving, and where are we going for calls for service. And it's kind of a whole hodgepodge of things that go into that one statement, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Thank you for that insight. Chief Umberger.
Yeah, so, the elephant in the room, right? The race. I think one of the community members posted that, when we stop people of color, there's a history of mistrust and they're afraid. And I continually hear that in conversations with police. I continually hear that in my interactions with people of color in our community. And that's a real thing to people of color. And I think the average everyday officer, maybe, of course now, I think they're aware of it, but maybe in recent years, they weren't as aware of that. And I think there needs to be a little bit more education for our officers with regard to the history of policing, particularly history of policing in the South, although, traditionally all across our country. That's not a block of instruction that is given at the police academy. And unless you, attended a university and have a criminal justice degree, you may not have been exposed to any type of historical information about the origins of policing in America. And so again, with a little bit of help from Miss Kathleen and some help with some colleagues of mine in the Pennsylvania State Police, I do an orientation training for all of our officers where I sit down with all new officers and kind of go over expectations and community policing, relationship building philosophy. We do a short lesson on the history of policing so that all the officers that come to work here in DeLand have a little bit of understanding about some of the mistrust that might be out there, in particular with people of color and their perceptions of law enforcement, so that when they have encounters, they have encounters, and have a little bit of empathy for the other person that they're dealing with. And this all goes towards another question there: do we have bias training? And yes, I mean, every human being has bias, regardless of their ethnicity. And that includes police officers. We're human beings and we all have bias. And one of the things that we brought here to DeLand is fair and impartial policing, which teaches us to manage through our own self-regulation our implicit biases that we all have. And the exciting thing is the research that was done in this area by many social scientists that Dr. Lori Friedel has referenced in her important book, Producing Bias-Free Policing. If we're motivated to be fair and impartial, we can self-regulate. That's what the social science tells us, and that we can produce bias-free, controlled behaviors and have controlled responses and controlled processes. As long as we're aware of our biases, we're motivated to address it, and we are really trying to control our behavior. So all of our officers go through fair and impartial policing. I have sent 2 of our officers. They were trained on how to train our new officers on fair and impartial policing. And we incorporate that into our use of force training now, into scenario training, and we try to show our officers that, you know, your bias policing actually makes you less safe. And we can reinforce that through some different training scenarios too. So that kind of like, what's in it for me? Well, you know, what's in it for the community is we produce fair and impartial policing, and we're policing in a more just manner. What's in it for the officer? They're probably going to be safer. So we try to incorporate that.
Thank you, Chief Umberger. Dr. Smith, would you like to respond in any capacity to some of those insights and thoughts?
Yeah, it just seems like, so one of the things that I do study, I'm not going to say I'm an expert, I'm definitely not an expert. One of the things that I've done research on is, you know, this idea that some of the, that we learn from the people around us, right? Essentially, it's something that basic, right? And there's a lot of research that supports that idea that we tend to learn less from videos or to television, that type thing, but we learn through interacting with other people, right? With an emphasis on people. And some of the most important people to us, those that we learn the most from, are like family members, like people that we grew up with. And so if you've got an area that is promoting bias against entire ethnicities, and now you're going to try to train them in a police academy that goes forever how long, I could see how that would be difficult to overcome. And it seems like there has to be this constant reinforcement to get anything done. And it really, it's nice to me. I mean, when I think about it, I try not to be too applied in my approach. I mean, there's a reason why I chose books and research, you know, and the science of it, studying it. But when I think about that, it's frustrating to me because it seems like you're overcoming generations of teaching that support this bias that are completely contradictory with what the chief is saying. And like, that's what I'm saying. It's nice to hear that the chief is saying, okay, well, there's definitely bias. Like, that happens, and it happens in everybody, police included, right? So trying to overcome that, you know, it just seems like that would be a difficult thing. And I see a lot of the comments coming up under here, and I think they fall under that umbrella of like, how do you combat family training, close friends training for decades, now that you're counting on them to apply policies that you can count on to become your routine traffic stop, you know? That's a difficult thing to navigate. And the literature has some suggestions on it, you know, in it, from what I've read and from what I've contributed to, but it's not a clear answer. And so I see the difficult place that the assistant chief and the chief are in. And I'm just interested to hear, like, how do they continually support that? Like, you can't just give them a bullet, you know? Like in communications theory, there's this bullet that you can, like the bullet theory, that you can just, like, you know, basically mind wash somebody, like wash them and then retrain them, you know, just through media and watching videos. And that's not going to happen. You can open them up to the suggestion of it, but actually getting them to believe that or to support your policies when you're not watching, you know, that can be difficult, especially when the people you're counting on are the ones that they're contracted by the government and larger community to be the watchmen, right? Or watch people, you know? Yeah, so any kind of practicals that the assistant chief or the chief can talk about where they're doing that like on a continual basis, because it just seems like that's what you would need. I think community policing is part of it, you know, of working towards that, but you're cutting against the grain of like, I don't know, like centuries of work, you know, that's been put in, like that's that's militating against what you're trying to accomplish.
Yes, all of those points, you know, are well said. It's very difficult. I think it obviously starts with screening candidates. And there was a question here from, I think, Chase A. Burke about hiring and, you know, what are we doing to hire, that the FBI has warned of white supremacists in law enforcement, et cetera. And what we do is as thorough of a background investigation as we can. And actually, as part of our voice stress analysis or polygraph screening, they have to respond to questions. You know, are you or have you ever been a part of, you know, a group that's subversive to the United States government, a racist organization? They have to successfully navigate through, you know, a polygraph voice stress analysis test to be screened, you know, in. We also are using some of the questions that Dr. Friedel suggests in her book when we do our final interview. Our senior command staff is screening, the last part of our screening before we offer employment. We're using some strategic questions to try to get at some of this, you know, bias. And is it, are these folks, you know, appropriate? Do they have the appropriate mindset to come into law enforcement? But it's very hard to screen that. And I'm actually looking at some more screening examinations, written examinations that are centered around trying to kind of give us an idea of psychologically of the person that we are looking at hiring. And there is, you know, specific questions are asked of the candidate that help get to the heart of who they are. I guess it's for a better lack of a better way of explaining it. As far as ongoing, again, we do, you know, I've instituted annual fair and impartial policing training, so refresher training every year. We try to inculcate that into other aspects of our training as well, particularly, you know, in scenario trainings when we're making, you know, use of force training, use of force decisions. So that we are hopefully reinforcing this throughout the organization, you know, annually. And it's become part of who we are. But again, you're battling against a lot of strong, maybe sociological, you know, upbringing that a person has, you know, the culture. And that's a challenge for sure. But the only thing I know to do is very good screening, you know, whether that be, you know, looking at the best types of screening analysis that we can use to try to make sure we're getting the appropriate people into this profession that are open and are willing to confront their own, you know, bias so that they can be more fair and just in their decision making. So I guess that's my best answer.
Thank you for that, Chief. I have a question in the chat that I'm going to go ahead and ask, and I am jumping the chat, but I'm going to come back around. And I did want to say, and we probably will go a bit past 3, not too much, but just to make sure we have time for all of the questions. I imagined that this panel may go a little bit longer than 3 o'clock. So just putting that out there ahead of time. Again, of course, no one needs to feel obligated to stay past 3. But there was a question from Eric Johnson. Thank you for this panel. Assistant Chief Lehman said that you talk about bias sometimes. I would be curious to hear what those conversations sound like. What comes up? Who's doing the talking? Are those informal conversations between peers or formal training or everything in between? I think it just kind of piggybacks off of what Chief Umberger was just talking about.
Yeah, I'll answer that. First, I just want to say real quick what the chief just mentioned about screening. Social media is, I don't necessarily want to call it the devil, but when we do our background investigations, I can't tell you how many people, because we go way back. We've disqualified people for stuff they posted 5 years ago on Facebook because it just, is it going to bring the department in disrepute, or the optics on it aren't good at all. And that's what I would encourage all the young college folks on here is you really got to be aware of what you post, because it may not be us, it may be another form of government or private sector that's looking at that stuff. So that's huge in our screening process. We really learn a lot about it. As far as bias in conversations, we do a little bit of everything. We're a state and a national accredited agency, so it's one of our accreditation standards is we have to do bias-free policing training every year, just like the chief mentioned. We do some of that via the computer where they review a PowerPoint. We talk about it in in-service training. Actually, this next month we have our annual protective action or use of force training where we go over less lethal, which is our taser and our spray, and then go into defensive tactics and things like that. But all of that goes into, we talk about, how you present yourself, how you, command presence and things like that. And then some of them are a lot of informal conversations, and it may not just be bias, but it may be talking one-on-one with someone. And as a supervisor, some of the things I heard when people would come in the front door and complain on our officers is they would say, I just felt disrespected. So that's what we talk a lot about, because if you disrespect somebody, that can make you feel like you're biased against that person. So we talk a lot about with our officers and a lot of those are informal conversations. Because you're just trying to make sure you stay on your officers and preach, do the right thing, treat people with respect.
Thank you for that comment. Did you have something else?
There was another question Harry asked about what services we have for our folks, and mental health and first responders is a huge issue, and it has been the last couple of years, and that's police, fire, EMS, even our dispatchers, because they never get to go to the call. They just hear it on the phone. They never get to see the other outcome of it. So most all organizations have an EAP or employee assistance program. We also have a peer support team. So if we've got a cadre of peer officers that may have been involved in a shooting or some type of very traumatic event, that they're willing to help and talk to other officers that may be going through an event like that. And, we monitor that. We look for sudden changes in behavior, different things like that. We'll pull them off the street and we'll get them help if they need it. But that's a huge focus right now. And that was a great question there.
Yeah, I can imagine the psychological stress that does go on in being a police officer right now would be quite extreme. If we can see that tension manifesting itself in the community, we can only imagine what it is to engage with that on a regular basis. So probably also something in thinking about de-escalation. And we didn't really have that de-escalation conversation, but if someone is happy to sort of talk with us a little bit about what de-escalation looks like in the field, what does it mean, how important is it in maintaining safe interactions between police and the citizenry, that would be great.
I'll piggyback real quick on that. We just at our agency brought in a group, outside group, so they weren't hearing from other department instructors, but we brought in an outside group and did an 8-hour block of de-escalation training for every sworn member. We partnered with the church, so we had a huge venue, so we could do social distancing and everything. But we required every one of our sworn persons to sit through that 8-hour class of de-escalation, so they could hear it from a completely different perspective than somebody in their own agency. And we just did that probably 3 weeks ago. And part of it sounds very simple to me, or maybe to you guys, but when you talk about de-escalation, a lot of it is not what you say, it's how you say it. And every one of us has probably said something where we're like, I probably shouldn't have said it like that. And, you know, you have to realize how you got to work through that. And that's kind of the basic premise. I know there's a lot more to de-escalation than that, but I think a lot of times you don't have to get to do de-escalation if you say it the right way, you know, and you deliver the message in an appropriate manner. De-escalation may never even get into the picture. I'll defer to the chief if he's got anything else to add.
Yeah, those are excellent points. And the other thing I might add about de-escalation is that so that the community has a good understanding of it. You know, de-escalation, when we have to use those techniques, and really what it is just very good communication. Like the chief said, it's how we say things to people. But de-escalation is a goal, and it isn't always attainable. And I think the community needs to understand that at times we can work and do and say everything, you know, right, and we can't de-escalate the situation. The person on the other end has determined that they don't want to be de-escalated, and they aren't going to comply, and you know it's gonna go in a different direction. So, you know, I love de-escalation. Obviously, our agency, we also brought in some outside training when I first arrived here as police chief and did some de-escalation training. We do it annually. You know, I'm sure probably Lakeland does as well. And we stress that, you know, using our good communication skills to diffuse, using the 4 tenets of procedural justice that are so important, I think, to effective communication, which is giving people voice. Boy, now I'm on the hot seat and I'm forgetting them. Giving people voice, being transparent and neutral in our decision making. And I'm drawing a blank, if you help me, Chief, on the last 2. But those 4 pillars, you know, are critical to good communication, and you know, help certainly with building rapport, and so that we never get to that point where, like as the chief said, we have to de-escalate. And I'll jump back in here with my last 2 pillars. Let me quick look them. Feel free to keep going.
Everybody looks like, because everybody looks like they froze up on my screen.
No, we're just waiting patiently.
Oh, okay.
We're waiting patiently. Okay, so while Chief Umberger is looking that up, I do want to have a final question because we are just 1 minute over 3 o'clock. But I did want to end with a final question for the panelists. And for everyone, if you could have one message, what would you say, you know, to the community regarding our interactions, our relationship building, our trust building? So just kind of leaving it on final thought, if you will.
I'll say something. One thing our chief always says in our community meetings is, you know, we are your police department, and in the city of Lakeland. He whenever we go to a neighborhood meeting, neighborhood watch, or any kind of special events, he's like, if you have concerns, you need to tell us. We are your police department. We work for you. And that kind of resonates with me because it is true. You know, we work for everybody. And again, that goes back to legitimacy and trust. And I know our city, we work really hard at community involvement and community contacts and attending things on the weekends and neighborhood cleanups. And, you know, all those little things help with legitimacy. And I think my message would be is, you know, we are your police department. We want to serve you. And if there's something we can do better, we need to know about it. And if we can improve it, you know, sometimes it takes a little time to improve things, but if it's something we can work on, we'll definitely be willing to do it.
Thank you, Chief. Chief Umberger, any luck or still searching? I'll bounce over to Wilson. Wilson, yep. Your thoughts and takeaways?
Yes. So I think like policing is a very complicated matter, especially with the way things are going now. And I think the biggest thing is community relations, as we've stressed again and again. I had the opportunity to interview a number of school resource officers, and a lot of people see them in place as a defense mechanism against violence at school or school shootings. But a lot of them saw their role as like a community relations expert. And so they were building these relationships with these students who, based on family experience, based on where they were growing up, did not like police, even though they'd never interacted with one. And what these officers were doing, were building a positive framework for the future. And so I think that is a great thing to do going forward. And I think would solve a lot of issues as we continue on trying to get to a better form of policing in America.
Thank you, Wilson. Chief Umberger.
All right. Yeah, all great points. So yeah, giving people voice in the decision making, being neutral and transparent in our decision making, and being respectful in our treatment of others, and also conveying trustworthy motives. Those four pillars, if we can practice those in all of our interactions, give us legitimacy, and we build trust in the community. And really the social research out there says if we practice those things consistently, that we're more apt to get compliance, voluntary compliance from the community. And so those are, you know, worthy goals for all of us as we strive as police to communicate with members of the community.
Thank you, Chief. And then Dr. Smith.
Okay. I feel kind of weird going last, like I'm like the least important member of this group, but yeah, what the chief was just saying reminds me of this guy in the literature who he's made his name, you know, to become a big fish in this pond off of like procedural justice. So he says that people care more about how they're treated with regard to due process. The guy's name is Tom Tyler, and he's like a Yale guy or something at the law school, but he's also got he's got a PhD in psych too. And he says that people make more money, or they make more, or draw more capital from, or you draw more capital from treating people, or having people believe at least that they are treated fairly, than even getting the outcome that they want. So it's actually more, with the research that he's done over the last like 25 years, it's actually more valuable to them that they were treated in a way, you know, with those basically and I'm generalizing somewhat, but what the chief said about those four pieces of communication, you know, proper communication, when they feel substantiated and procedurally, it's actually much more valuable to them than outcome, and you're going to create much more capital from that kind of interaction than them even like getting out of the ticket, you know, or whatever, you know, getting some kind of result. So yeah, that's the thing that these chiefs and Wilson, you know, with you know, with his impressive work, you know, makes me think of. So anyway, thanks again. Thanks to the chiefs. And I know it's not my appropriate, you know, I'm not the moderator, and I appreciate Dr. Jackson very much for setting this thing up. It's been a great opportunity for me, and yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. Thank you, everyone on the panel. I have a final word as someone who is Black and lives in America. And my perceptions of law enforcement do not deviate from the community and sort of what we see on television. I will have to say that this conversation makes me very hopeful that things can be different. I've learned many things in just listening to our chiefs and Dr. Smith, Wilson, in thinking about continuing the conversation, because sometimes we can get quite, we can lose hope and sort of give up on trying to work to build those relationships. And so it's, I find it very inspiring to hear that there's so much good work being done in these departments and efforts to reach out to the community, and efforts to also create really strong and healthy police departments. So that's extremely wonderful news to hear. All right, so thank you again, all of our panelists. Thank you to everyone. I again apologize for taking up some extra time today, but I just felt like this conversation was probably going to go just a bit over. A reminder for those with the cultural credit, do fill out the form, the link that's in the chat, and thank you again to everyone today. Thank you.